Mike Tyson is more than a name in sports history. He's a force of nature, a living storm that once shook the boxing world to its core. When Tyson stepped into the ring, it wasn't just a fight. It was an event, a shockwave, a moment the world held its breath for. He was power, speed, ferocity, and mystery all wrapped into one unforgettable figure. From the gritty streets of Brooklyn to the roaring lights of global arenas, Tyson rose with a hunger and intensity the world had never witnessed. He became the youngest heavyweight champion ever. An unstoppable prodigy who tore through giants with a raw, almost frightening brilliance. His demolished opponents weren't just defeated, they were overwhelmed, as seen in that legendary 91 second destruction of Michael Spinks, one of the most explosive moments the sport has ever seen. But behind the knockouts and the crowds that screamed his name was a boy shaped by hardship. A childhood marked by poverty, violence, and abandonment. A kid who carried wounds far deeper than any punch he ever threw. Tyson fought his way upward, not just for fame, but for survival, transforming himself from a troubled youth with a soft voice into a global icon, feared by champions and adored by millions. And now, at 59, the same man who once terrified the boxing world faces a new kind of battle, one without spotlights or cheers. A battle against regret, against old traumas that never truly healed, against the fragile realities of aging and a lifetime of scars. These are struggles no opponent could prepare him for. As we walk through the triumphs and tragedies of this extraordinary life, we invite you to join us. If this story moves you, if you respect the journey of a man who rose, fell, and kept rising again, please consider giving this video a like. It's a small gesture, but a tribute to the complex, remarkable, and unforgettable legend that is Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson recently opened up about a struggle that has followed him long after his glory days in the ring. During a heartfelt appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live, the legendary former heavyweight champion spoke candidly about a stubborn foot condition that has affected him for years. With the same honesty and intensity that defined his boxing career, Tyson described the issue as a disintegrating dose of foot trouble, something that has been with him since the very beginning. As Tyson reminisced about his early rise in the 1980s, he explained why he never wore socks when he stepped into the ring. It wasn't just a style choice, it became part of the fearsome image that the world knew him for. That was my identity, Tyson said. Raw, unfiltered, no socks. But behind that powerful persona was a hidden battle he carried quietly. With a seriousness that hushed the studio audience, Tyson revealed that this foot condition had grown worse over the years. It was really bad, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has fought not just opponents, but life itself. It's still really bad now. I got it treated. I'm being completely honest. There was a vulnerability there, the kind that reminds us even icons have their struggles. When Jimmy Kimmel asked if this lingering condition had become Tyson's greatest rival, Tyson nodded with a hint of humor and truth mixed together.
Yeah, he admitted. It's still giving me a hard time today.
It was a rare moment where the warrior acknowledged an opponent he couldn't simply overpower. Kimmel tried to lighten the moment by suggesting Tyson would be perfect for a commercial promoting foot care products. Tyson smirked but shook his head, saying nothing could truly fix what he's dealing with. My toes look like they swelled up, he joked, but beneath his smile was the reality of a long-standing physical battle. Even so, Tyson continues to move forward. He and Floyd Mayweather have already agreed to face each other in an exhibition bout set for 2026, a matchup only legends could deliver. Tyson, ever the fighter, remains undeterred. His last appearance in the ring was in November 2024 when he stepped in against Jake Paul in an 8-round heavyweight match at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas. Though the decision went to Paul unanimously, Tyson walked out with the same dignity and fire that shaped his entire career, a living testament to resilience. In the months leading up to that unforgettable night, Mike Tyson faced a wave of serious health challenges. Among them was a painful ulcer flare-up that forced the highly anticipated fight to be postponed. For most people, such setbacks would have been enough to step away entirely. But Tyson has never been a most people. His life has always been a test of endurance. And, once again, he found himself fighting a private battle long before he stepped under the arena lights. But the world didn't know the full story. until after the final bell rang. Only then did Tyson reveal the truth that in June 2024, he came frighteningly close to losing his life. Sharing the story with raw honesty on X, he wrote, "This is one of those situations where you lose, but still win." His words carried a depth that only someone who has walked through the darkest moments can truly understand. Tyson explained that he had undergone 8 blood transfusions, a staggering number that spoke to just how critical his condition was. He had lost half of his blood. He had dropped 25 pounds while hospitalized. And even then, even after enduring what would break most men, he fought his way back, determined to stand strong once more. He had to fight to get healthy to fight, he wrote, revealing a truth more powerful than any headline. The battle outside the ring was far greater than the one inside it. Yet, despite the physical pain, the medical obstacles, and the weight of time itself, Tyson stood tall before a roaring crowd of thousands in the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. He went 8 full rounds with a skilled fighter nearly half his age. But for Tyson, the real victory came from something far more personal. Having his children watch their father fight with the heart of a warrior, refusing to quit. To have my children see me stand toe-to-toe. Toe is an experience no man has the right to ask for, he said, with sincere gratitude. A thank you. It wasn't just a fight. It was a testament, a living reminder of the strength, resilience, and unbreakable spirit that has defined Mike Tyson for generations. It is one of the great tragedies of life that some of the world's strongest champions are forged in places that nearly crushed them before anyone ever spoke their names. Mike Tyson's story begins exactly there, in the shadows before the spotlight. On June 30th, 1966, inside Brooklyn's Fort Greene Hospital. From the moment he arrived, his world was shaped by instability and loss. His biological father, Purcell Tyson, disappeared so early that Mike would later admit he had no memory of the man at all. Just an empty space where a figure of protection should have stood. For a short, fragile stretch of time, another man, Jimmy Kirkpatrick, filled that role. But he too walked away when Mike was only 2 years old. Another quiet heartbreak. Another wound that settled into the spirit of a child who hadn't yet learned how to defend himself. What remained was his mother, Lorna Tyson, tired, resilient, and carrying more weight than any one person should. She fought with everything she had to keep her children, Rodney, Denise, and little Mike, from slipping deeper into the pull of poverty. They bounced from one failing apartment to the next, each move more desperate than the last, until they finally landed in Brownsville. It was a neighborhood many tried to escape, a place where hope felt like a guest who never stayed long. Brownsville in the 1970s was unforgiving. Cracked sidewalks stretched across blocks like scars. Streetlights flickered as though exhausted themselves. The nights were ruled by sirens and shouts, the kind of noise that seeps into a child and becomes part of his understanding of the world. Inside their drafty apartment, walls peeling, floors cold, and a refrigerator that often held more air than food, Mike learned hunger. He learned silence. He learned what it felt like to go without. He was a gentle boy at first, small, shy, unsure of his place in the world. His oversized glasses and soft lisp made him an easy target. Kids pushed him aside, laughed at him, treated him as if he weren't even there. "A people looked right through me," he would later say. It was a haunting truth, one that showed how deeply shame had found a home in him before confidence ever had a chance. With a mother overwhelmed, siblings each fighting battles of their own, and no adult around to shield him, Mike began to understand something that no child should ever have to learn. That in a world full of chaos, he would have to find his own way to survive. When a child grows up without anyone to stand between him and the world, survival becomes his only teacher. That was Mike Tyson's reality. Loneliness didn't just follow him. It wrapped around him so tightly that it became part of who he was. But even in the middle of Brownsville's noise and danger, far above the chaos on the rooftops, Mike discovered the only gentleness life had ever given him: pigeons. Up there, where the air felt a little calmer, Mike found a strange kind of peace. He built pigeon coops out of scraps of wood he pulled from abandoned lots. He saved bits of his school lunch to feed them. And he whispered to them quiet secrets he never trusted anyone else with. "They were the first things I ever loved," he once said. In those moments, surrounded by wings and soft coos, he felt connected to something pure, something kind. For a boy starved of affection, those birds were not pets, they were his refuge. But the world has a way of tearing away the things fragile hearts hold most dear. One afternoon, everything changed. A neighborhood boy, the kind who enjoyed watching others hurt, grabbed Mike's favorite pigeon. Before Mike could reach him, the boy ended its life and left the delicate creature still and silent on the ground. To everyone else, it was nothing. Just another cruel act in a place where cruelty was common. To Mike, it was the end of the only gentle piece of his world. He later said it felt like the world broke apart in that moment. The cold wind stinging his face as heartbreak and humiliation washed over him. Something inside him cracked. Not suddenly, but after years of being pushed aside, ignored, forgotten. A fire took shape inside him, fueled by pain, fear, and a promise he made to himself right then and there. He would never be powerless again. That vow followed him into the streets, searching for belonging, for anyone who might let him feel seen. He was drawn toward older boys who moved with toughness and confidence, boys who ran with a local neighborhood crew called the Jolly Stompers. They weren't a family, not in any real sense, but for a child desperate to matter, desperate to not feel invisible anymore, they offered something that felt close enough. They felt close enough to belonging, close enough to being noticed. Mike followed their lead without hesitation, running errands, carrying out small tasks, and absorbing the unwritten rules of the streets the way other kids memorized homework. Trouble didn't shock him anymore. It became a part of his routine, as familiar as the cracked sidewalks he walked every day. Police paperwork began to pile up with his name on it, each incident blending into the next until the number became almost unbelievable. By just 13 years old, Mike Tyson had been detained nearly 40 times. But when the world outside grew too loud, too harsh, too unkind, he sought refuge in the forgotten corners of Brownsville, the abandoned buildings no one cared about anymore. Their broken windows and hollow rooms became his sanctuary. In those quiet, dusty spaces, Mike threw punches at the air with everything inside him. Each strike echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off peeling paint and cracked concrete. These weren't just punches, they were promises. Every swing carried the vow he had whispered to himself over and over. No one would ever make him feel small again. Then, in 1978, one misguided moment changed the direction of his life. Out of desperation, acting without thinking, he took a woman's purse. That decision sent him far from Brooklyn to the Tryon School for Boys in upstate New York, a place designed to correct, but often only deepen the wounds of the lost kids sent there. If Brownsville had been harsh, Tryon was colder in a different way. The long hallways seemed to stretch on forever, lit by weak bulbs that buzzed in the silence. The metal frame beds groaned whenever a boy turned in his sleep. And the quiet was the heaviest of all. It settled into the chest, made breathing feel heavier, made loneliness feel sharper. But the greatest pain wasn't in the building itself. It was in the visitor's room. For 9 long months, Mike sat in the chair closest to the door, his eyes fixed on the entrance every visitation day. He waited and waited, hoping to see his mother walk through, hoping she'd reach out and say she hadn't forgotten him. But she never came. I thought nobody cared, he would say years later, still carrying the ache of that boy who stared at a door that never opened. Yet it was within those bleak walls, at the very moment, life seemed determined to bury him. That fate stepped in. A turning point was coming. A person who would change everything was about to enter his life. One afternoon, in the quiet hum of the Tryon School gym, everything changed. Bobby Stewart, a counselor, a disciplined man, and a former boxer carrying his own history of bruises and victories, paused as he watched young Mike unleash a torrent of punches against a heavy bag. What he saw didn't make sense for a boy that age. Each strike was fueled by something deeper than muscle. It was raw power mixed with heartbreak, a wounded fury shaped by years of being ignored, abandoned, and pushed aside. Stewart stood still, his breath catching for a moment. He didn't see a troubled kid, headed down a dead-end path. He didn't see a case file or a mistake waiting to happen. He saw possibility, explosive, unpolished, and extraordinary. He saw a spark in Mike's eyes that told a story of survival, of a boy who had endured more than most grown men. A spark he believed could be shaped into something world-changing. For the first time in Mike Tyson's life, an adult didn't turn away. Someone finally saw him. It's incredible how a single moment, a single person willing to look deeper, can redirect a life everyone else had already judged, dismissed, or given up on. That moment led Mike to a place that would become the birthplace of a legend. At just 14 years old, Mike Tyson stepped into the Catskill Boxing Club, escorted by Bobby Stewart after months of training, discipline, and watching the boy transform his anger into controlled power. Mike walked in expecting the same fate he'd experienced with adults his entire life: judgment, rejection, or the cold indifference of someone who looked right through him. But waiting inside that dim, dusty old gym was a man who had already lost much, but refused to stop believing in greatness. Cuss D'Amato. Cuss stood there with his tired shoulders, his voice weathered by years of hardship, and eyes that could see through a person's defenses as if they were made of glass. He didn't flinch at Mike's size. He didn't recoil from his reputation. He didn't meet him with fear or doubt. Instead, he observed him, really observed him, in a silence so intense it made the room feel frozen. Seconds passed like lifetimes. Then Cuss D'Amato said the words no one had ever spoken to Mike Tyson before. Words so bold, so impossible, that the world would later remember them. Believe you can be the youngest heavyweight champion in the world. A wounded boy found a mentor, a child found direction. The words struck Mike deeper than any blow he had ever taken in the ring. All his life, people had looked right past him, as if he were invisible, as if nothing great could ever rise from a kid like him. But in that quiet, echoing gym, something unfamiliar crept into his chest. Something powerful, almost frightening. It was the weight of finally being seen. From that day on, Mike's world shifted with a force as sudden as the punches he would one day become famous for. Cuss didn't just open the doors of his gym. He opened the doors of his home, his dinner table, his late-night conversations, and most importantly, his belief. For a boy who had drifted from place to place, who had spent nights in rooms colder than the streets outside, stepping into Cuss's house felt like stepping into a new life. For the first time, someone kept a hallway light on, not out of habit, but to remind him he wasn't walking this world alone. But belonging came with a price, and Cuss made that clear. His discipline was relentless, the kind of toughness Mike had never known. Those 4:00 a.m. runs through the freezing Catskill air, cut into his lungs like shards of winter. His legs shook as he pushed himself up those endless hills, every step a battle against the memories of Brownsville, the bullies, the hunger, the loneliness he tried so hard to outrun. And that was only the beginning. Then came the real training: 2,000 squats, 25,500 sit-ups, 500 dips, and neck exercises that felt like they were sculpting a fighter out of pure will. Sparring sessions with full-grown men who hit with the force of sledgehammers pushed him far past what he believed his body could survive. More than once, Mike fell asleep aching so deeply he wondered if he'd even wake up the next morning. But inside that pain, something rare began to take shape. A small, fragile spark, something he'd never been allowed to feel before. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he could become someone. Cuss was shaping Mike in ways that went far beyond the ring. Cuss was molding me, Mike would say many years later. Not just my fists, but my mind. And it was true. Cuss wasn't building a fighter. He was building a young man who had never been given the chance to believe in himself. But every rise demands something in return. As Mike poured every ounce of himself into the gym, the young boy inside him, the one who still carried a quiet longing for the comfort of a mother's embrace, was confronted with a heartbreak he could never truly escape. In 1982, when Mike was only 16, his mother Lorna passed away. He had spent so many years trying to outrun the emptiness her struggles had carved into him. But grief is patient and grief is persistent. It always finds you, even when you move mountains to avoid it. He cried not just because she was gone, those close to him remembered, but because she never got to see the person he was becoming. Decades later, when Mike spoke about it, his voice still faltered. My mother never saw me become anything, he said softly. It wasn't guilt speaking. It was longing, a yearning for a moment he never got to have, for a pride he never had the chance to give back to her. But in that hollow space, in that quiet ache, Cuss stepped forward. Not as a trainer balancing talent, not as a mentor just polishing potential. He stepped forward as the father figure Mike had been missing since the day he was born. Cuss became his legal guardian, grounding him with a steady, unwavering presence that Mike had never experienced. For the first time in his life, someone chose him, not out of duty. Not out of duty. Not out of responsibility, but out of pure, unwavering belief. And under Cuss's guidance, Mike began to transform into something the boxing world had never witnessed. A storm in motion. A disciplined, explosive force, sharpened not just through strength, but through psychology and intention. Cuss taught him the peekaboo style, tight, compact, fearless. Mike learned to slip punches with barely a hair's width to spare, to strike back from angles that seemed impossible, to move with the urgency of a man who understood that every second in the ring mattered. Cuss wasn't just teaching him how to fight. He was teaching him how to survive, how to rise, how to become the version of himself that the world had never expected. But the world would never forget. Mike spent hours, sometimes entire nights, studying old footage of Jack Dempsey. He watched every subtle shift of weight, every deliberate dip of the shoulder, every punch thrown with a kind of raw conviction that couldn't be faked. He absorbed it all, the rhythm, the violence, the strategy, until it felt like the movements were carved into his bones. His knuckles throbbed. His ribs ached. His breath often came in short, burning bursts. But for the first time in his life, pain didn't feel like punishment. It didn't embarrass him or remind him of everything he wasn't. Instead, it shaped him. It gave him direction. It became the forge where purpose was hammered into steel. And in those breathless moments between rounds, when the gym fell silent, except for the thud of his heartbeat, Cuss would lean in close. His voice, weathered by life and battles of his own, delivered lessons Mike never forgot. The hero and the coward feel the same fear, Cuss whispered. It's what you do with it that matters. Those weren't just words. They were pillars. They didn't only teach Mike how to fight, they taught him how to stand, how to endure, how to live with intention. In the heat of that tiny Catskill gym, surrounded by sweat, discipline, heartbreak, and belief, something extraordinary happened. Iron Mike began to rise. Everything Cuss had built inside him, the discipline, the sharp awareness of what it meant to lose everything, the burning hunger to prove he mattered, ignited the moment Mike Tyson walked into the ring for his first professional fight on March 6, 1985. Yay! He was only 18. But he stepped through the ropes with the weight of a prophecy on his shoulders. A prophecy Cuss had spoken quietly in those long training nights. You were born to be a champion. His debut opponent, Hector Mercedes, didn't last long. Less than 2 minutes after the opening bell, an uppercut ended the fight with the harsh finality of a chapter closing. It was as if Mike had slammed the door shut on the life he had fought so hard to escape. What followed that year was nothing short of astonishing. Tyson fought at a pace that seemed almost beyond human. 15 fights in just 12 months, and he won every single one by knockout. Each victory wasn't just a win, it was a statement, a declaration that all the pain, all the nights in the cold, all the grief he carried had been transformed into something unstoppable. Mike's rise wasn't just rapid, it was explosive, breathtaking, almost unreal. Each fight he stepped into felt like watching history sprint instead of walk. The purses grew from $5,000 to $30,000 and beyond, but the pressure grew even faster. Fame was arriving like a tidal wave, and he was barely 18. Yet behind the roar of crowds and the bright arena lights, there were the quiet nights, the hotel rooms where Mike lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a weight no one else could see. With every victory, he wondered if the promise he had made to honor Cuss to fulfill the destiny planted in him was a burden too heavy for one young man to carry. I was scared every fight, he admitted years later. Scared of failing him. As 1986 moved forward, greatness didn't just approach Mike, it chased him, it cornered him, it demanded more. Tyson crushed Marvis Frazier in just 30 seconds. A knockout so sudden, the announcers barely had time to catch their breath. The world stood stunned. Money rushed in, headlines erupted, and boxing prepared for a storm unlike anything it had ever seen. A hurricane wearing black trunks, no robe, and the expression of someone who walked straight out of destiny. But even a rising king must face battles that test more than strength. Against Jesse Ferguson, an accidental clash of heads forced a stoppage. The fight ended before Mike could finish it his own way, and he paced the ring with fury, feeling robbed of the ending he wanted to deliver. Then came James, a bone crusher Smith. Then what followed was 11 grueling rounds of clinches, tangled arms, and suffocating frustration. It wasn't a contest of power, it was a war of patience, something far harder for a fighter built on explosive force. But through every challenge, every irritation, every moment where the fight dragged rather than erupted, Mike marched forward. He fought not for applause, not for money, not for fame. He fought out of devotion for the man who had given him a home, a purpose, and a reason to believe in himself. Even though Cuss was gone, Mike carried him into every round. On November 22nd, 1986, the boxing world witnessed a moment that felt larger than the sport itself. At just 20 years old, Mike Tyson unleashed a storm upon Trevor Berbick, a force so intense it looked as if Berbick were trying to outrun gravity itself. His legs buckled, his balance crumbled, and he stumbled across the ring as though the punches had rearranged the very ground beneath him. And then, in under 6 minutes, it was over. Mike Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in history. The crowd erupted in a roar that rattled the walls of the arena, but in Mike's heart there was a quiet emptiness. A silence where Cus D'Amato should have been standing. The $2 million purse meant nothing compared to the absence of the man who had shaped him for this moment. The title he had dreamed of holding was finally in his hands, but the one person he wanted to hand it to was no longer alive to receive it. The following year exposed the true burden of a crown every fighter wanted to steal away from him. Tyson marched forward through a lineup of challengers, each one determined to be the man who stopped the unstoppable. He seized the WBA title from a bone crusher Smith, a fight that tested his resolve as much as his power. Then came Pinklon Thomas, a seasoned warrior with a dangerous jab. Tyson dismantled him with a relentless combination that left even seasoned commentators stunned into silence. They weren't just watching a champion, they were watching evolution in real time. But the real trial, the fight that would show whether Tyson could endure not just threats, but true resistance, came against Tony Tucker. For 12 draining rounds, Tucker refused to fall, refused to break, refused to give Tyson the knockout he had grown so accustomed to delivering. Fatigue clawed at Mike, doubt whispered in the back of his mind. And behind it all, the ache of Cuss's absence pulsed like a bruise he couldn't shake. Still, he pushed forward. When the final bell rang and the judges' scorecards were read, Mike Tyson stood victorious by unanimous decision. He had unified the WBA, WBC, and IBF titles. He was no longer just a champion. By 21 years old, Mike Tyson was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, the ruler of an entire era, the holder of every major belt, and a young man earning purses that soared higher with every fight. But behind every cheer and every triumph was a heart still fighting to honor the man who believed in him first. The boy who once hid behind oversized glasses, trying to stay invisible from the cruelty around him, would one day rise into something the world could hardly believe. Those early days of fear and uncertainty shaped a fire inside him, a fire that would later shake the entire sports world. The timid kid so many overlooked began forging himself into a figure of unstoppable power. Little, he transformed into a force that demanded attention. Soon, when he walked toward the ring, entire arena seemed to pause. Lights dimmed as if paying respect. Broadcasters softened their voices, sensing they were in the presence of something rare. And opponents, grown men with champion's pride, felt their confidence melt beneath his stare. The world gave him a name that echoed like a legend, Iron Mike. And everything, every fight, every struggle, every scar, was building toward one night. June 27th, 1988. A night when destiny didn't whisper, it thundered. Tyson versus Michael Spinks, a collision the world had spent years waiting for. The matchup of the decade. A fight that drew in an incredible $21 million in pay-per-view buys and earned Tyson a record-breaking $22 million, the highest purse of his life at that time. The atmosphere was electric, almost trembling. Every seat was filled with icons, actors, athletes, legends, each one knowing they were witnessing something historic. As Tyson made his walk through that long, echoing tunnel, he carried a calmness that didn't come from arrogance, but from purpose, from destiny. He looked like a man carved from discipline and shaped by survival. When the opening bell rang, Tyson didn't just fight. He erupted. His movements were sharp, explosive, almost unreal. His very first punch cracked through the silence like a thunderclap, sending a ripple of shock through the crowd. Soon, seconds later, a final, ruthless combination crashed into Spinks and sent him falling to the canvas. That was all it took. And in that brief, unforgettable moment, history didn't simply change, it detonated. Flashbulbs burst around the ring like tiny explosions of white light, each one freezing a moment that felt too big for a single lifetime. Fans clung to each other as if holding onto proof that what they were seeing was real. Commentators pushed their voices to the edge, shouting over the roar, desperate to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Across the world, millions stared at their screens in disbelief, watching a coronation that had been disguised as a fight. And in the center of all that chaos, beneath the glare, the applause, the disbelief, stood Mike Tyson. The championship belts shimmered across his shoulders, heavy with history. His chest rose and fell as the sound of the crowd wrapped around him. Yet behind the steel in his expression, behind the unbreakable image the world adored, there stirred a quieter truth. Years later, in a moment far from the bright lights, he said softly, "Just wished he could have seen it." Because no matter the glory, no matter the wealth, no matter the thunder that followed his every step, that night, that victory, that eruption of history belonged to the kid who had climbed from absolute nothingness. The kid who had once been overlooked, pushed aside, written off. Overlooked. The kid who now stood on a summit so bright that the entire world had no choice but to lift its eyes. And sometimes those shadows move faster than even the strongest among us can run. For Mike Tyson, that shadow began following him at just 19 years old. It started the day he lost Cus D'Amato in November of 1985. Cus wasn't just a trainer. He wasn't just a mentor. He was the father figure Tyson had spent his childhood searching for. He was the anchor who steadied him when the world felt unstable, the voice that taught him discipline, emotional balance, and the powerful truth that greatness means nothing if it doesn't come with character. Cus shaped the foundation of the man the world would one day call Iron Mike. And losing him meant losing the one person who saw not just the fighter, but the fragile, hopeful boy beneath the gloves. Tyson kept winning after Cus's passing, but inside he felt a terrifying shift. Like a car still racing downhill with no one left to guide the wheel. He continued fighting, continued knocking down opponents, continued collecting belts. But yet the center that once held him steady had gone. Quiet. And then, just 3 years later, when he was only 22, fate struck once more. Jimmy Jacobs, his gentle, brilliant manager, a man known for his kindness as much as for his knowledge of the sport, lost his battle with leukemia. Jimmy was the one who protected Tyson from the darker corners of boxing, the one who balanced business with genuine care. Tyson would later admit, when Jimmy died, it felt like the lights went out for the second time. Shortly after, Kevin Rooney, the final link to Cus's teachings and discipline, was pushed out of the team. And with Rooney gone, the last guardian of the philosophy that shaped Tyson's greatness vanished. Into that widening void stepped Don King, glittering with promises, wrapped in influence, and offering a world that sparkled with temptations. With Cus and Jacobs gone, Tyson's moral compass, once so firmly set, began to drift out of reach. Training sessions grew shorter. His world filled with people, yet not one of them delivered honesty. They offered praise, indulgence, and noise, but never guidance. Tyson would later look back and say, "I was a kid with too much power and nobody to tell me no." And the cracks began to spread. Street altercations erupted, none more infamous than the encounter with Mitch Green, which left Tyson with a fractured hand. Police were called to his home more and more often. His young marriage to Robin Givens collapsed under emotional turmoil and relentless public attention. Bit by bit, the foundations built by Cus were eroding, and Tyson found himself standing in a whirlwind he no longer knew how to control. Even though Tyson's records still showed nothing but victories, the first subtle tremors of inner collapse began to surface. At just 23, he wiped out Henry Tillman in mere seconds, another explosive finish that reminded the world of his terrifying power. But then came Alex Stewart, and for the first time in a long while, Tyson absorbed punches he never should have taken. They were small warnings, quiet, almost whispered signals that, when a man strays from the discipline that built him, everything stacked upon that foundation begins to shake. By early 1990, Tyson stepped into Tokyo not as the unstoppable machine the world had come to expect, but as a young man carrying years of unresolved grief, exhaustion, and emotional weight. His training had been scattered, his focus fractured, his support system long gone. Yet the world, the entire boxing universe, expected another Tyson masterpiece, another demolition, another reminder of his dominance. But instead, It witnessed the most stunning upset the sport had ever seen. Buster Douglas, a 42-1 underdog, walked into the ring that night with a depth of determination Tyson could not match in his state. After being knocked down in the 8th round, Douglas rose from the canvas with a fire fueled by heartbreak, purpose, and something greater than fear. And in the 10th round, he unleashed a series of punches that sent Tyson crashing to the canvas, stunned, disoriented, scrambling on hands and knees as he searched blindly for his mouthpiece, the image of Iron Mike. Confused and crawling, shocked the entire world. But for Tyson, it was more than a loss. It was the moment every champion must confront. Raw talent alone is never enough. Discipline is what carries a man when strength cannot. Later, reflecting on that night with a pain that still lingered, Tyson said, "It felt like a dream I couldn't wake up from." The fall was not just a defeat. As a consequence, Tyson would later reflect, a lesson delivered in front of millions, proof that even giants will fall when the ground beneath them begins to crumble. And from that moment, the descent grew steeper. In 1992, at only 25 years old, Tyson faced a legal conviction that would place him behind prison walls for 3 long years. When the cell door slammed shut for the first time, Tyson described the sound with chilling clarity. It was like hearing my whole life closing. Locked away from the chaos, the fame, and the cameras, he was forced to confront the versions of himself he had spent years outrunning. The anger that had no direction, the success that lacked purpose, the fame that came without understanding. Behind those walls, he endured isolation, conflict, and nights so heavy, he questioned whether he even wanted to move forward. "I was lost," he would admit years later, 3 words spoken not with shame, but with honesty. Yet within that darkness, something unexpected began to take shape. Prison, for all its pain, forced him to slow down, to think, to see himself without the noise. He began to read page after page, searching for meaning. He prayed. He shadowboxed in a small yard, letting his body remember the discipline his mind had forgotten. He wrote letters, trying to make sense of the storm inside him. The time did not erase his mistakes. It did not excuse them. It sparked the first flicker of self-awareness. A quiet moment of clarity in a life that had moved too fast for too long. "Discipline is everything," he said later. Without it, I was nothing but potential. And potential is dangerous when it has no guidance. His return in 1995 at age 29 drew thunderous cheers, but inside Tyson, the battle felt different. He stepped back into the ring with the same power, the same aura, the same intimidation. Yet something essential had shifted. He reclaimed world titles, defeating Frank Bruno and Bruce Seldon with the force that once made opponents tremble. But the victories, as impressive as they were, felt strangely hollow. The spark that had once carried him, the spirit forged by Cus D'Amato's teachings, seemed dimmer, like a flame fighting against the wind. And then came 1997. The highly anticipated rematch with Evander Holyfield, 2 warriors, 1 rivalry, 1 night with the world holding its breath. But in a moment fueled by frustration, confusion, and emotional turmoil, Tyson acted impulsively, shocking millions watching around the globe. He would later say, "I regret that moment deeply. Anger made the decision for me." The consequences were severe: a $3 million fine, a year-long suspension, and a wave of condemnation that swept across the world. But years later, Tyson described it not as rage, but as a man who had never learned how to face pain, disappointment, and fear in a healthy way. It was a moment that exposed not a monster, but a deeply wounded human being struggling to cope. The decline continued. In 2002, Lennox Lewis, bigger, stronger, more focused, overwhelmed him. And in 2005, at 38 years old, sitting on the stool between rounds against Kevin McBride, Tyson whispered words that hit harder than any punch he had ever thrown. "I don't have it in my heart anymore." In that vulnerable sentence, the world heard the closing of a chapter. A warrior who once felt unstoppable now felt empty. But the fall wasn't only inside the ring, it became financial as well. By 2003, after earning over $400 million throughout his career, some estimates placing it closer to $700 million, Tyson filed for bankruptcy, buried beneath $23 million in debt. He later admitted with painful honesty, "I trusted the wrong people, and I didn't trust myself enough to slow down." Extravagance drained his fortune. Mansions, cars, luxuries, and even Bengal tigers that cost $70,000 each. It was a life spinning too fast, too loud, too bright, and the crash felt inevitable. He was a man who once moved through life like a storm, earning $125,000 a year just in training, surrounded by more than 100 luxury cars, slipping into a $2 million gold bathtub, and wearing diamond watches worth more than $500,000. His entourage was massive, the spending constant, and the money burned away faster than any victory could bring it back. He even let go of his grand Connecticut mansion, selling it to 50 Cent, a symbol of how far the tides had turned. And yet, for all the glitter he once lived in, there were nights when he found himself in tiny rented rooms or stretched out on a friend's couch, quiet places where the echoes of his past felt louder than any crowd. The man who once ruled the world now stood in a stark, silent room, signing papers that represented something far heavier than financial collapse. They marked the emotional price of losing control, the spiritual weight of watching the life he built crumble piece by piece. It wasn't just bankruptcy on a page, it was a mirror reflecting everything he'd been running from. But even in that lowest moment, something small and stubborn refused to die. A quiet ember, maybe hope, maybe humility, still glowed inside him. At 40, stripped of the symbols that once defined him and humbled in a way only life can truly humble a person, he finally began to grasp the message Cuss had tried to instill decades earlier. A man's worth isn't etched into belts, fame, or the roar of the crowd. It comes from who he becomes when the cheering stops. And in that fragile moment of reckoning, something inside him began, slowly, quietly, to shift. His story, marked by scars and mistakes and tangled history, wasn't closing. It was unfolding again. This time, towards something wiser, gentler, and perhaps for the first time, fully human. There comes a moment in the journey of every fallen legend when the applause finally fades, the arena stands empty, and a man is left staring at the one truth he can't outrun anymore. For Mike Tyson, that moment struck with a quiet force after his bankruptcy. When the roar that once carried him across continents evaporated into absolute stillness, he found himself standing in a nearly empty room, surrounded by the scattered remnants of a life that had once felt untouchable. Trophies, memories, fragments of a world built at lightning speed, now reduced to objects he could barely recognize. And in that silence, he confronted the one opponent he had spent his entire life dodging: himself. He realized I couldn't keep blaming life, he would later admit with a rare softness. I had to change. Those words weren't just a confession. They were the beginning of a transformation few believed he could ever make. At 40 years old, stripped of belts, stripped of fortune, stripped of the identity that once defined him, Tyson began a rebirth that didn't start with crowds or cameras. It started quietly, within. Long before the world noticed anything different, he began the slow, painful work of rebuilding from the inside. Therapy took the place of chaos. Steady routines replaced the unpredictability that once ruled his days. Early mornings, once fueled by fear, pressure, and the hunger to destroy, became moments for reflection, discipline, and rebuilding a spirit that had been battered long before any opponent ever stepped into a ring with him. He returned to the teachings of Cus D'Amato, not the jabs or combinations, but the lessons whispered during the quiet moments when no one else believed in him. Lessons about discipline, about honesty, about humility, about becoming a man before becoming a champion. Like Cus always said, a fighter's biggest battle is with himself, Mike reflected. And for the first time, he understood the depth of those words. Not as a fighter, but as a human being finally learning how to heal. It took me a lifetime to understand that. Tyson would later say, words shaped by pain, time, and the long road back to himself. And slowly, piece by piece, he began rebuilding. Not a reputation, not an image, but a foundation. Solid, honest, and finally strong enough to stand on without collapsing. His resurgence didn't begin with a punch or a comeback fight. It began somewhere far more vulnerable, on the stage. When Tyson stepped onto Broadway in 2012 with undisputed truth, he didn't hide behind gloves, intimidation, or the mythology that had followed him for decades. He walked out beneath the bright theater, lights carrying something far heavier, his truth. He spoke openly about loss, about regret, about grief that had followed him long after the crowds went home. He revealed emotional scars that success had never touched, pains no championship belt had ever eased. And as he stood there, unarmored and unfiltered, audiences didn't see a fallen champion. They saw a man brave enough to confront every shadow of his past without looking away. The show became a cultural moment. Raw, unexpected, unforgettable. It grossed millions and proved that Tyson could command a room not with force but with honesty, not with fury but with reflection. From that point forward, the world saw a different side of him. Doors that once seemed permanently closed opened again, roles in films, appearances on television, new business ventures, and a powerful presence on motivational stages. These weren't fueled by chaos or impulse anymore. They were driven by intention, by clarity, and by discipline. By the early 2020s, Tyson had rebuilt an estimated $30 million for, but this time it wasn't earned through destruction through the old cycle of rise and collapse. It was built through reinvention, through wisdom collected the hard way, through choices rooted not in pride, but in genuine growth. His comeback was no longer counted in belts or knockouts. It was measured in responsibility, in redemption, in becoming the man Cuss always believed he could grow in. In the end, Mike Tyson's greatest victory didn't happen under the bright arena lights. It happened not in a ring, not beneath a spotlight, but in the quiet, powerful decision to rise again and shape a new life with clarity, humility, and the courage to start over. This was the true turning point, the moment where strength no longer meant force, but honesty. Some of the deepest wounds in Mike Tyson's life were not carved by fists or opponents. They were carved by love, by fragile hope, and by the longing that anyone might finally see the heart hidden beneath the storm. For all the legends built around him, at his core he was a young man searching for connection, for peace, for a place where he didn't have to fight to earn his worth. When he met Robin Givens in 1987, he was just 21 years old, undefeated, unstoppable, but emotionally unanchored. Robin, only 23, came from a world completely different from his. A world of education, refinement, and steady calm, shaped by a strong mother who had guided her with discipline and purpose. Tyson later admitted he was drawn to Robin's presence, to her strength, to the way she carried herself with an effortless confidence, as if she belonged in every space he had once felt shut out of. "She made me feel like I could be more," he said. And for the first time, the boy who grew up fighting for his place in the world felt the possibility, however fragile, of a gentler future. Their connection sparked quickly, intense and bright, the kind of bond formed by two young souls searching for something neither had truly known before: stability, tenderness, a sense of normalcy. Tyson respected Robin's intelligence, her grace, her sense of direction. Robin, in turn, saw not the unstoppable icon the world obsessed over, but the vulnerable young man behind it all, a man carrying wounds far deeper than any headline could describe. In those early moments, their lives collided with a rare hope, a belief that maybe healing was possible. On February 7th, 1988, a quiet promise was made. Mike Tyson, just 22, and Robin Givens, 23, stood together and exchanged vows in a ceremony that felt less like a spectacle and more like a soft breath of hope. Two young hearts, believing they could build something peaceful in a world that never stopped shouting their names. Oh. For Tyson, that day was more than a celebration. It was a dream he had carried since childhood, a dream of fatherhood, a dream of breaking the long chain of abandonment that had shadowed him from the day he was born. "I wanted a family more than anything," he later shared. "I wanted to feel normal." And in the midst of roaring arenas, flashing cameras, and a fame that followed him like a relentless tide, it was the small, gentle moments with Robin that brought him a sense of calm. Late-night conversations whispered in the dark, shared fears, quiet hopes, imagined futures that felt fragile but beautiful. In those peaceful spaces, Tyson believed, truly believed, that he had found a place where his heart could finally rest. But love built on unhealed wounds is delicate. And when the cracks form, they echo louder than anyone expects. Fame wrapped itself around their marriage like barbed wire. Cameras trailed their every step. Reporters dissected each expression, each gesture, each moment. Paparazzi camped outside their home. Headlines spun rumors faster than they could be denied. Privacy, once a simple part of life, became something they no longer possessed. Tyson struggled under the weight of two worlds, the savage pressure of the ring and the fragile responsibility of a home he desperately wanted to protect. Robin, thrust into global fame overnight, fought to find her balance in a life that spun faster than she could steady. And beneath all of it was a shared ache they rarely spoke of, the longing to start a family, a longing Tyson held closer to his heart than he ever admitted publicly. A longing that became another quiet sadness between them, another unanswered hope. Every setback widened the quiet space forming between them, a distance not created overnight, but slowly, silently, almost invisibly. And the moment everything finally reached its breaking point did not arrive with shouting or conflict. It came through something far more devastating, the truth spoken under the brightest, harshest lights imaginable. Only months after their wedding, Robin sat beside Tyson during a televised interview. Her voice trembled beneath its calm surface, her hands tightly clasped together, as if she were holding the pieces of herself from scattering. She spoke about fear, about pressure, about the emotional turbulence that had seeped into their marriage long before anyone knew. And Tyson, just inches away, yet emotionally galaxies apart, stared forward in stunned silence. The studio lights blazed down on him. The cameras felt cold and relentless, and in that unforgiving moment, the most private corners of their hearts were placed on display for millions to witness. Tyson later reflected, "I didn't know how to save it. I didn't even know how to save myself." It was a confession filled with years of pain, confusion, and the weight of a life that had taught him how to fight everyone, except himself. That interview didn't destroy their marriage. It simply unveiled what had already been fractured beneath the surface. What the world interpreted as spectacle was, behind closed doors, two young hearts buckling under the weight of expectations, fame, and wounds they were never taught to navigate. Their arguments were not eruptions of anger. They were collisions of hurt. Tyson, shaped by hardship and survival from the earliest age, expressed pain through defensiveness, through retreat into old patterns meant to protect him. Robin, raised in structure, discipline, and high expectations, met pain with distance and withdrawal. Both were hurting. Both were misunderstood. And both were too young, too overwhelmed, and too unhealed to bridge the widening gap between them. Both felt abandoned, just in different ways. And around them, advisors, lawyers, agents, and endless headlines swirled like static, drowning out the two voices that most needed quiet. Every new legal filing, every accusation printed in bold ink, every misunderstanding amplified by the press, pushed them farther apart. Their home, once imagined as a sanctuary, slowly transformed into a place where hope bounced against walls thick with unspoken fears. They weren't fighting each other. They were fighting everything they had never healed from. By early 1989, less than a year after they had stood together and promised forever, their marriage collapsed beneath pressures that neither youth nor love could possibly withstand. There were no children to bind them through the storms, no calm moment strong enough to hold back the relentless tide of fame, expectation, and emotional wounds. The newspapers focused on the $10 million settlement, printing numbers as if they were the heart of the story. But the real loss didn't exist in money, contracts, or courtrooms. The real loss lived inside two people who had once believed they might heal together. Tyson would later say that the end of their marriage felt like a losing a part of myself. I didn't know how to get back. It was the kind of grief that didn't roar, settled, quiet, and heavy in the spaces where hope used to live. Robin, years later, spoke about navigating fear, confusion, and the overwhelming challenge of finding stability with someone carrying storms that began long before she ever arrived. She wasn't pointing blame. She was acknowledging a truth both of them came to understand. Love alone wasn't enough when both hearts were still learning how to survive. They walked away not as enemies, but as two people mourning a future that never had the chance to grow roots. Their story was never about villains or heroes. It was about timing. Two young souls meeting at a moment when healing was needed more than romance. Two young souls, both gifted in ways the world could see, and wounded in ways it could not, crossed paths before either had learned how to steady their own hearts, let alone hold someone else's. The world wanted to pick sides, to shape a simple story out of a complicated truth. But what lived between them was far more human. They were overwhelmed, inexperienced, and trying to build love on foundations still cracked from the past. Scars too deep for affection alone to mend. When their marriage finally came undone, Tyson didn't just lose a partner. He lost the first fragile version of the family he had been dreaming about since childhood. The dream that kept him going during the darkest nights in Brownsville slipped through his grip, leaving behind a silence heavier than any blow he ever took in the ring. It was a heartbreak that didn't just hurt. It widened another fracture in a life already marked by struggle. And that fracture would soon grow into storms that nearly swept him away. There are moments in a man's life when the ground shifts beneath him, when every decision he makes, wise or flawed, reveals more about his inner turmoil than his intentions. In 1988, as Mike Tyson's marriage to Robin Givens began to fall apart, the emotional distance between them stretched long before any papers were signed or statements made. It was a quiet unraveling, the kind that happens when two people are still trying to understand themselves, while the world watches every step they take. Tyson was still legally married, still hurting, still trying to make sense of a life that was collapsing faster than he could gather its pieces. And in the middle of that fragile, unsteady chapter, he crossed paths with Naomi Campbell, a young woman on the rise, already carrying herself with a presence that turned heads and steadied rooms. Her confidence, her calm, her discipline, they stood in stark contrast to the chaos closing in around him. Their meeting was never a grand romance, nor the dramatic scandal people later tried to imagine. It was simply a moment, two young stars brushing against each other in the whirlwind of fame. Tyson, vulnerable and unanchored. Naomi, stepping firmly into the world spotlight with the grace of someone shaped by discipline, mentorship, and a strong maternal force guiding her steps. She moved with purpose. Tyson moved with pain he didn't yet know how to carry. In that difference, there was a flicker of curiosity, a touch of compassion, and the brief illusion of shelter. They appeared together at public events, shared a few light, easy moments, smiled for cameras that would later craft their own stories. But behind every polished photograph was a far quieter truth. Tyson was a man standing in the middle of a storm he didn't know how to weather, and Naomi, perceptive and grounded, sensed the instability in him. She saw that there was no steady ground, no place for anything meaningful to take root. Their connection was brief, human, and real in its simplicity, but it was never built to last. Tyson would look back on those years with a clarity that only distance and time can give. He would later admit that he kept searching for comfort in the world around him because he hadn't yet learned how to face the storms inside his own heart. He was a young man who had never been taught how to heal, trying to outrun wounds that always managed to catch up. Naomi, on the other hand, was steady, her life driven by discipline, by ambition, by a focus sharpened through years of hard work and strong guidance. She recognized the turbulence surrounding Tyson, and with a quiet grace, she stepped away. There was no argument, no dramatic ending, no bitterness. Their connection faded the same way it arrived, softly, honestly, with an unspoken understanding that neither of them had the stability or emotional space to build something real. Both of them were moving at impossible speeds, living lives that demanded far more than any young person could fairly give. And in that recognition, their brief intersection becomes something more than a footnote. It becomes a quiet lesson. Even the brightest icons, the strongest personalities, can find themselves making choices shaped not by desire alone, but by exhaustion, confusion, or loneliness. It doesn't erase the choices. It doesn't excuse them. But it does shine a light on the humanity behind them. Tyson would later describe this chapter of his life as a time when I didn't understand myself. Naomi continued rising, her career reaching new heights as she walked her own path with determination. They went forward separately, each molded by pressures few could imagine, each living under lights that never dim. Their short moment together stands as a reminder that unrecognized vulnerability can guide even the most powerful among us toward decisions that later become mirrors, reflecting not the person we truly are, but the person we were struggling desperately to understand and become. It's heartbreaking how a man can come so close to the peace he's been chasing his entire life, only to learn that some wounds refuse to stay in the past. Some follow him into every new beginning, no matter how desperately he wants to leave them behind. 4 years after his first marriage unraveled under the harsh glare of cameras and public judgment, Mike Tyson crossed paths in 1990 with Monica Turner. a Georgetown pediatric resident whose presence felt like the first breath after years spent underwater. She was calm where he was volatile, disciplined where he was hurting, raised in a world built on stability and structure. A world Tyson had only ever seen from the outside, never from within. Tyson would later describe being with her as hearing life at a gentler volume. For the first time, the noise that had chased him since childhood, the fear, the rage, the memories, seemed to quiet down long enough for him to feel something close to peace. Their connection didn't burst into existence or crash into chaos. It unfolded slowly, through small acts of kindness, thoughtful conversations, and those quiet moments where two people begin to understand each other without needing to say much at all. Monica didn't turn away when the world hurled headlines at him. She didn't cling to the myth, and she didn't romanticize the turbulence. She stayed with a steady heart, believing that the man behind the legend, the man named Michael, deserved a chance to grow, to heal, to know a different kind of life. And when Tyson walked out of prison in 1995, at just 29 years old, stripped of titles and carrying scars no one could see, Monica was one of the few standing at the door waiting for him. Not waiting for the fighter, not waiting for the champion, but waiting for the man who was trying, piece by piece, to rebuild himself from the wreckage. On April 19, 1997, they were married in a quiet, private ceremony. Far from arenas, far from crowds, it was more than a wedding. For Tyson, it was his first genuine attempt to rewrite the story of his life, to build something steady in a world that had always been anything but. Their daughter, Reina, arrived in 1996. Their son, Amir, followed in 1997. And Tyson would later say, holding them felt like touching a future I never believed belonged to someone like me. In those moments, he tasted the life he had dreamed about since he was a boy wandering the streets of Brownsville. Mornings filled with laughter, warmth in the walls, a family that felt solid and alive. For a brief time, the world seemed gentler, almost within reach. But peace is a delicate thing, especially for someone who grew up without it. Beneath the calm surface, old wounds began to resurface. Trauma, mistrust, and restless patterns Tyson had never learned to confront. His schedule tugged at him, his emotions surged unpredictably, and the weight of his past pressed against the life he was trying to build. He loved his home, but he didn't yet know how to protect it. Monica carried more than most ever saw. She worked long shifts as a young doctor, cared for 2 small children, and tried to support a husband whose heart flickered between wanting to be present and being pulled back into shadows. He didn't fully understand. There were nights when Tyson didn't come home, days when he drifted away emotionally, and long stretches of quiet that felt heavier than anger. In her eventual divorce filing, Monica cited repeated betrayals of trust, actions Tyson would later acknowledge without argument. Reflecting years later, he spoke with a regret that sat deep in his voice. I wanted to be the man my family needed. I just didn't know how to stay steady. It wasn't a failure of love. It was a man wrestling with wounds he had never been taught to heal. In a quiet moment shared only with a trusted friend, Monica once whispered a truth that carried the weight of an entire lifetime. I couldn't mend the places in him that refused to be mended. It was a single sentence. Simple, soft, and yet shattering. It revealed what so few ever understood, that these were 2 people who loved each other across a fault line, neither of them created. Their undoing didn't arrive with thunder or confrontation. It arrived slowly, like shoreline sand giving way grain by grain. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was erosion, the gentle, unbearable kind. The kind where doors close quietly because the shouting has long since turned into silence, where hope stretches thinner each day, until at last, it breaks not with a cry, but with a sigh. By January 2003, after 6 long and complicated years of marriage, Monica made the decision to file for divorce. Headlines rushed to talk about numbers. Around $10 million, they reported, as if the story could be reduced to a figure splashed across a newspaper. But behind those headlines lived a deeper cost, one the world would never fully see. There was the moment Monica gathered Reina and Amir, 2 children who had grown up in the glow and shadow of a life far bigger than their age, and walked away from a home built with love, but shaken by wounds that never found healing. The children stayed mainly with her, not out of conflict or possession, but because she had been their anchor during the years when Tyson's world swayed unpredictably between brilliance and darkness. Tyson would later reflect on that day with a quiet honesty few expected. He said, "Watching them leave felt like losing the future I prayed for my entire life." It wasn't rage that broke him. It was the hollow stillness that remained when the laughter of a family fades from a house meant to hold it. And yet, even in separation, their story never turned cruel. There was dignity, there was respect, there was a tender, unspoken understanding that sometimes two people can care deeply, try endlessly, and still drift apart, not because they failed, but because their pain outweighed their strength. Today, Tyson speaks of Monica not with resentment, but with gratitude for the years they walked together. And she, in turn, has never spoken of him with harshness. Their history is held gently, proof that love, even when it breaks, can remain kind. Their story has never needed villains. It was never about blame, never about winners or losers. It was about two people who crossed paths at a time when both were carrying wounds they didn't yet know how to release. They didn't hurt each other out of cruelty. They simply arrived in each other's lives before either of them had learned how to put their burdens down. When that marriage faded, Tyson didn't just lose a companion. He lost the only glimpse of the steady, loving home he had prayed for as a boy standing in the dim stairwells of Brownsville, searching for warmth in a world that rarely offered it. To him, that family had been a promise, a possibility that he could rewrite his story. And when it slipped away, it carved a new fault line in a life already shaped by too many. Some heartbreaks don't thunder into existence. They appear like hairline cracks in the soul, quiet, nearly invisible, until one day they split time itself into a before and an after. And in the early 2000s, as Mike Tyson struggled to keep together the fragile pieces of a life worn thin by grief, public pressure, and exhaustion, something unexpected happened. He found a different kind of comfort, unexpected, imperfect, and deeply human, in a connection with Soul Zoid. Between 2003 and 2005, Soul entered his orbit, not as a fan chasing fame, not as a headline waiting to be written, but as someone who recognized the frightened, uncertain man behind the myth. Tyson was in his late 30s then, Soul in her early 30s, two people walking through their own storms, searching for a moment of shelter wherever they could find it. Their relationship was far from flawless. It was fragile, raw, and often unsteady, stitched together by two people trying to create warmth in a world that kept turning cold on them. They weren't building a fairy tale. They were simply trying to breathe. And when their daughter, little Exodus, arrived in 2005, Tyson discovered a feeling he had never known in his entire life. He would later say, "She made me gentle. I didn't even know that part of me existed." For a man whose world had always demanded toughness, whose very survival depended on strength, love came to him in the smallest, quietest form imaginable. A baby girl with bright eyes and a laugh that sounded like hope. Their home in those early years wasn't polished or easy. There were days when money felt thinner than patience, when emotions ran high and answers felt scarce. But through all of it, every memory orbited around that lively, curious child who filled their rooms with warmth. She didn't just brighten the house. She rewrote the atmosphere. Tyson, who sometimes struggled to understand how to be a partner, poured every ounce of his heart into learning how to be a father. He held Exodus against his chest, feeling her tiny hands grasp his shirt. He brushed the curls away from her eyes. He kissed her forehead as if trying to memorize the outline of the life she had yet to live. Soul saw a version of him most people insisted didn't exist. She saw the quietness in him, the tenderness, the gentleness that lived beneath the armor. She saw the way he lifted Exodus into the air, whispering soft promises she was too young to understand, but promises he needed to say out loud, if only to remind himself he was capable of giving love, not just surviving pain. Tyson would later remember a single fragile moment with her and say, when she held my cheeks in her little hands, I felt like maybe, someday, I might be okay. And for a brief, precious stretch of time, that tiny child softened every hardened corner of his spirit. She became the light in a life that had known too much shadow. But then came May 26, 2009, a date that would carve a permanent fault line through his world, dividing everything into before and after. It began as an ordinary morning, the kind so quiet, so uneventful, that no one would remember it if not for what followed. There was no warning, no shadow creeping in from the edges. Life was simply moving the way it always had. And then, in a single, devastating instant, the unimaginable occurred. Exodus, only 4 years old, full of life and brightness, became accidentally caught in an exercise machine inside the home. It happened in moments, silent and unfathomable, the kind of tragedy that arrives without sound, without reason, without mercy. Miguel was nearby, just 7 years old. A child still learning how the world works, suddenly confronted with something no child should ever see, let alone try to understand. His innocence was interrupted by a moment too heavy for even an adult heart. Soul rushed into the room, and the world seemed to freeze. One look, just one, and she understood the gravity of what she was seeing. Her instincts ignited. With hands trembling but determined, she began CPR, her voice shaking as she called for help. Panic tried to break through her words, but the fierce, desperate love of a mother held her together. It was the kind of panic that only appears when life shifts beneath your feet and nothing will ever be the same again. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Fast, focused, skilled, they followed every protocol, every procedure, everything human training could offer. Exodus was rushed to the hospital, where the warmth of home was replaced by the cold, sterile brightness of emergency lights, machines, and urgency. Tyson was in Las Vegas when the call reached him. A father of 43, a man who had already endured more storms than most people ever encounter, and yet nothing in his past, no hardship or heartbreak, could have prepared him for those words. He boarded the first flight to Phoenix without thought, moving through the airport like someone walking underwater. Everything muted, distant, unreal. Later, he admitted he remembered almost nothing of that journey. Not the takeoff, not the landing, not a single face that passed him or a single voice that spoke. "I just kept telling myself, get there, just get there," he said. Flight was not measured in miles. It was measured in dread. In the weight of a father racing time itself, praying that somehow, against all odds, he wouldn't arrive too late. The hours that followed felt endless, an ocean of time in which every passing second became a silent plea for a miracle. And when Tyson finally stepped into the hospital, reality met him with the force of an entire lifetime collapsing at once. There was no chaos, no shouting, no frantic rush of nurses or doctors, just a stillness, heavy, suffocating, the kind of stillness that only exists when a story has reached its most devastating end. The doctors spoke with a quiet compassion reserved for tragedies that have no villains and no explanations. They delivered the news with soft voices, but those words struck harder than any blow Tyson had endured in the ring. Exodus had passed shortly after he arrived. Tyson later said, in a tone shaped by a grief deeper than language, "Nothing prepares you for that. No pain on earth goes deeper. It changes you forever." What followed wasn't an outburst. It wasn't anger. It wasn't rage. It was silence. An unbearable, suffocating silence, the kind that shatters a person from the inside out. Tyson didn't blame Soul. He didn't blame Miguel. He didn't blame the world. He didn't blame the... Instead, he folded into himself, grieving in a way no camera, no headline, no public moment could ever truly portray. There are heartbreaks the world thinks it understands, and then there are the ones that break a human being at their core. This was the latter. Soul withdrew completely. She shielded Miguel with everything she had, trying to protect him from the tidal wave of public attention and carrying a guilt no mother deserves to feel. A chapter born of heartbreak, but one that quietly altered the course of his entire life. Some turning points slip in so quietly that their importance isn't understood until years later, usually when a person is standing on the very edge of collapse. Mike Tyson found himself on that edge, bankrupt, grieving, and weighed down by a loss no parent should ever bear. He moved through those years like someone walking through the remnants of a life that no longer felt like his own, drifting between the shadows of who he had been and the uncertainty of who he could become. And then, almost without planning or design, Leah Chichi Spicer appeared in the silent space the world had left behind. Fine, she didn't enter with grand gestures or loud promises. She arrived softly, almost like a breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. a small, steady warmth seeping back into a home that had been cold for far too long. She carried her own history, one marked by turbulence, a complicated family, and a past that included time behind bars. These were chapters she didn't revisit often, pieces of her story she kept tucked away like fragile pages. Yet when she looked at Tyson, there was no hesitation, no fear of the storms he carried within him. She recognized that storm. She understood what it meant to rebuild a life out of fragments and quiet determination. Before anything resembling love existed between them, there was recognition, two souls who had endured more than most, meeting in a place where silence felt safer than words. They connected in the unseen hours, the moments the world would never witness. Late-night conversations where Tyson's voice shed its armor, and he spoke not as a fighter, but as a man trying to understand the pieces of his own heart. Early mornings where Chi-Chi found him sitting alone, staring at a life that felt too heavy to step back into. And in those moments, she didn't push or question. She simply stayed, offering presence instead of pressure, companionship instead of expectation. When their daughter, Milan, was born in 2008, Tyson held her as though she were both a promise and a second chance, hope wrapped in the form of a newborn. It felt like I was holding a life I didn't think I'd ever earn, he said. And in that moment, you could see a man trying to learn gentleness all over again. Then came 2009, the year tragedy struck with a force that shattered what little certainty he had left. When the devastating loss of Exodus tore through him, leaving him cracked open and drowning in grief, Chi-Chi did not retreat. She did not flinch from the darkness. She stepped closer, anchoring him when he felt like he was falling through the world. Just 2 weeks later, in a small quiet chapel in Las Vegas, they married, not in triumph, not as a celebration, but as two wounded people choosing not to face the darkness alone. It was a vow of solidarity, a promise to hold on to each other when life felt impossible. But love between two souls, shaped by decades of scars, is never simple. Those early years were raw, unpredictable, and shadowed by old fears that surfaced without warning. Their journey was uneven, marked by pain, but also by the fragile hope that perhaps, together, they could rewrite what their lives had once been. Tyson found himself wrestling battles that didn't take place in a ring, nerve pain that stole his sleep, sudden emotional spirals that rose like storms without warning, and a quiet, haunting fear that he was destined to lose every family he tried to build. These weren't the kind of fights the world could see. They were the kind that crept in during the stillness of night, whispering doubts he had carried since childhood. Chi-Chi, meanwhile, was learning to become a mother while still healing from her own past. She cared for little Milan, welcomed their son Morocco in 2011, and worked tirelessly to keep their home steady on the nights when Tyson's silence grew so heavy. It felt like a physical weight in the room. Money was uncertain. Tempers sometimes rose and fell like unstable tides. Old habits from older lives tried to slip back in. And there were nights when Chi-Chi stood in the doorway with her keys in her hand, wondering if staying was an act of strength or a quiet betrayal of the woman she was trying to become. There were nights, too, when Tyson sat alone in the next room, convinced that history was circling back. "I kept thinking I'd destroy this family, too," he said once, his voice carrying the painful honesty of a man who knew exactly what destruction looked like, because he had lived through it before. Odds up. Yet through every fracture, every moment when their marriage stood on the very edge, they kept choosing each other. Not flawlessly, not easily, but intention. Tyson learned to apologize without hiding behind his defenses, to show up for Milan's early morning tennis practices, even when pain shot down his spine and made each step feel impossible. He forced himself to sit through therapy sessions and meditation practices he once would have mocked, trying to quiet the storms inside him rather than unleash them. Chi-Chi learned to draw her own boundaries, to confront the patterns she carried from her upbringing, and to love Tyson without disappearing into the shadows of his life. She learned that loving him did not mean losing herself. Together, they built a life the world never imagined they could hold onto. A home shaped not by perfection, but by routine, patience, and the gentle kinds of joy Tyson once believed were forever out of his reach. There was laughter in the kitchen, discipline in the day-to-day, and a fragile sense of peace that slowly took root. Peace Tyson had spent most of his life convinced he would never feel. It wasn't a miracle. It was work. hard. It was choosing growth over escape, choosing presence over fear, choosing repair over repetition. It was two people refusing to let old wounds write the ending for them. More than 15 years later, they are still together. Not because life suddenly became simple, but because they refused to let pain dictate their path. Their story endures not as a picture of flawless romance, but as a testament to perseverance, to forgiveness, to the courage required to rebuild an entire life from the remnants of a broken one. Tyson often says, "Cheeky loved me when I didn't love myself." Yet the deeper truth is something even more powerful. He finally learned to love someone enough to change, and she remained at his side as he slowly rebuilt the pieces of himself he once believed were lost for good. In the family they've created a daughter, Milan, chasing her tennis dreams with relentless passion, and a son, Morocco, growing into a calm, grounded young man. Tyson found something he had prayed for as a little boy staring through the cracked windows of Brownsville. He found a home. Not a home built on perfection or unbroken histories, but on effort, on discipline, on mercy, on the brave, almost defiant choice to stay when the world expects you to walk away. And then, as every fighter eventually discovers, a moment arrives when the opponent waiting for him isn't a man standing across the ring, it's the silent pushback of his own body. Mike Tyson, once a storm compressed into human form, a man who moved with explosive certainty, stepped into his 50s carrying the physical cost of decades, spent pushing his body past every natural boundary. The same fist that once ended fights in seconds now ached when the morning air turned cold. The spine that once absorbed entire avalanches of punches tightened like a locked door. Tyson would laugh about it sometimes, saying his mind still woke up, ready to train like a world champion. But his body needed a moment, rising slowly, patiently, one controlled breath at a time. Sciatica stabbed through his lower back like a blade, being slowly twisted. His knees complained with every step. His shoulders crackled, each pop echoing the memory of the battles he had survived long ago, but none of it felt like weakness. Tyson's journey through pain, recovery, and acceptance became a steady beacon for older fans, for people battling their own aging bodies, for anyone waking up each day to chronic discomfort, fading strength. His story offered a powerful and often overlooked truth. Resilience isn't just in throwing punches. It's in getting up each morning willing to care for yourself, willing to adjust, to endure, to heal, and in learning to protect the very body that once carried him through storms, Mike Tyson found a victory more profound than any knockout. A victory measured not by force, but by the courage to grow older, with intention, with dignity, with an unbreakable will. Now, at 59 years old, Mike Tyson stands inside a chapter of life few would have predicted for him. A chapter not shaped by the chaos or violence of his past, but by the discipline, clarity, and patience he spent decades trying to master. After plunging from unimaginable wealth into bankruptcy, after drowning beneath more than $23 million in debt, Tyson rebuilt a stable, purposeful, and carefully structured life with his own hands. His net worth today sits between $25 and $30 million, earned not through spectacle or frantic decision-making, but through consistent, thoughtful work. Through businesses shaped with intention. Through choices designed to protect the family and future he once feared he would never live to see. His globally streamed Hotboxin' podcast, with tens of millions of views, became one of the centerpieces of his rebirth. An open space where celebrities, athletes, and everyday people sat across from a man who had survived his own legend. Add to that his film and television appearances, best-selling book deals, international speaking tours, brand partnerships, and ownership stakes in lifestyle and wellness companies. Each venture carried the unmistakable aura of someone who has lived harder than most and risen wiser than almost all. But the clearest, most symbolic evidence of Tyson's transformation is not found in the spotlight. It's in his real estate, the physical spaces where his new life was built, quietly, intentionally, from the ground up. His primary home in Las Vegas is a serene, art-filled sanctuary spread across wide stretches of desert land. Sunlight pours through open, peaceful living spaces. Polished stone floors echo with calm rather than chaos. The walls are washed in soft earth tones, creating a gentle warmth throughout the home. Here, Tyson built a private, fully equipped gym, not a monument to violence, but a space for health and discipline. A dedicated meditation room glows with soft lighting, a reminder of how far he has traveled from the turmoil of his early years. Outside, a tennis court stands as a tribute to Milan's dreams, built so she could train with focus and pride. The outdoor areas feel like a different world: sculpted gardens, a resort-style pool, shaded patios where conversations move slowly, and quiet nooks designed for reflection rather than spectacle. It bears no resemblance to the chaotic estates of his past, homes once overflowing with excess and noise. This home belongs to a man who now values order over showmanship, calm over chaos, purpose over performance. Beyond this sanctuary, Tyson expanded his investments with thoughtful precision: small apartment complexes, rental homes, parcels of land spread across Nevada and Arizona. Bought quietly, steadily, carefully, exactly the way he once wished someone had taught him when he first became wealthy. These properties don't shout luxury, they whisper stability. They speak of long-term equity, of steady passive income, of a man who once lost everything and vowed never to be swallowed by financial chaos again. They reflect discipline, patience, and the slow, deliberate growth of someone determined to remain in control of his future. His garage, once a symbol of impulsive excess, now mirrors this transformation with striking clarity. Gone are the endless rows of cars bought on a whim, forgotten as quickly as they were acquired. Today, he keeps a refined, carefully maintained collection: a pair of timeless Bentleys, a pristine Rolls-Royce with custom interior detailing, a limited edition Ferrari built specifically to his preferences, and a small group of collector cars, vintage muscle legends, and European exotics. Each vehicle is polished, documented, and positioned with the precision of museum pieces. These are no longer trophies of extravagance. They are artifacts of intention, markers of a life rebuilt not through chaos, but through care. Yet Tyson's greatest transformation isn't measured in real estate or cars or financial recovery. It lives in the way he wakes each morning. He rises early, before the world stirs. He meditates. He stretches slowly through the stiffness that age brings. His training routine is no longer designed to dominate. It's crafted to preserve longevity, to protect the body that carried him through storms of his own making. He treats himself with a tenderness he once reserved for no one, respecting his body like a fragile engine that has survived war and now requires grace. He listens to doctors. He honors rest. He chooses foods that heal rather than harm. Age teaches you what strength really is, he said. Not power, but wisdom. And through his podcast and public conversations, Tyson has become an unexpected guide for people searching for discipline, patience, emotional steadiness, and the courage to rebuild a life after breaking it. His reflections are not polished speeches. They are raw, honest lessons drawn straight from scars. Lessons about responsibility, healing, and the slow art of becoming someone better than the person you used to be. His transformation is not dramatic for the cameras. It is not performed. It is sincere, quiet, steady, deeply earned. And that sincerity is what resonates with millions of people searching for their own second chance, their own path out of the darkness they once thought permanent. His family is the heartbeat of his life today. Milan Tyson, born in 2008, is rising through the world of competitive tennis with a devotion that mirrors the intensity her father once carried into the ring. She trains daily, competes nationally, and moves with the focus of an athlete who knows her father is watching, not from a place of pressure, but from pure pride. Tyson never shouts from the sidelines. He leans forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on his daughter with a quiet, glowing admiration. Not the roar of a fighter, just the soft, steady pride of a father who is grateful to witness her journey. His son, Morocco, born in 2011, fills Tyson's days with a gentler kind of joy. They make breakfast together, stretch before workouts, and share small father-son moments that most men take for granted. But Tyson once feared he would never live long enough to experience. These simple routines, these daily rituals, have become some of the most precious parts of his life. His older children, Ria thriving in filmmaking, Amir carving his own path in business, and Miguel exploring creative work, have stepped into adulthood with independence and intention. They were raised not in the shadow of their father's past, but in the warmth of his unwavering support. Tyson talks about them with a softness that surprises those who only knew the fierce, unstoppable warrior version of him. "My kids are my redemption," he once said. And in those few words lies the truth of a man who chose to reshape his legacy not through power, but through love. His marriage to Chi-Chi is the foundation beneath all of it, an anchor built not on the myth of perfection, but on forgiveness, structure, and the daily discipline of two people committed to protecting the peace they fought so hard to create. Theirs is a partnership strengthened by storms, not weakened by them. Beyond the walls of his home, Tyson gives back, not loudly, not for applause, but with intention. He supports youth programs, mental health initiatives, re-entry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals, food outreach efforts, and local boxing gyms that nurture children growing up the way he once did. He remembers the boy he used to be, and he spends his time trying to make sure the next generation has opportunities he never had. Overlooked, underestimated, and often simply in need of someone to believe in them. Those are the people Tyson feels called to help. Portions of his podcast revenue and brand partnerships quietly flow towards shelters, youth centers, and community organizations throughout Nevada and New York. Over the past decade, his contributions have reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, not as publicity stunts, not as carefully staged moments, but as sincere acknowledgments of responsibility. "If I survived everything I've been through," he said once, "then maybe I can help someone else survive their storm too." In that commitment lives the core of the man he has become. Not a fighter chasing applause, but a human being searching for meaning. Tyson's life now is not perfect, and he doesn't pretend it is. His body still reminds him of its limits. His past still whispers when he least expects it. And the world, at times, still tests his resolve. But the difference today is profound. He no longer defines himself by the mistakes behind him. He defines himself by the courage it took to rise after them. His journey proves something rare and powerful, that a person can lose everything, fall to the lowest depths, shatter the life they built with their own hands, and still return stronger, quieter, and wiser. His story stands as a reminder that reinvention is possible at any age, that healing is worth the work, and that no one is defined by their darkest chapter unless they choose to stop reading there. If you're searching for strength, for hope, for a sign that your future is still unwritten, look to the man who fought his way back, not to the ring, but to himself. And from our hearts to yours, we offer this wish, not just as narrators of a story, but as fellow travelers on the road of becoming. May your next chapter unfold with abundance that nourishes your spirit, clarity that cuts through doubt, strength that carries you through every trial, and peace that settles softly into the corners of your life.